The morning Cheryl Ridgeway knocked on my door waving a bright yellow fine notice like it was some kind of trophy. The temperature outside was sitting at 6 degrees Fahrenheit, and I had been awake since 4 in the morning trying to keep my pipes from freezing. 6 degrees. The kind of cold that makes your nose hairs turn into little ice crystals the second you step outside. The kind of cold that turns your driveway into a skating rink and makes your truck engine sound like a gravel mixer when you first turn it over. And this woman, wrapped in her puffy North Face jacket with her HOA lanyard bouncing against her chest, was standing at my door before 7 in the morning to tell me I had violated HOA Regulation 4.17, subsection B, which apparently prohibited idling a personal vehicle in a private driveway for more than 5 continuous minutes. I stared at her for a long second. Then I looked past her at my truck sitting in the driveway, exhaust curling up into the frozen air, the windshield still clearing from fogged up to transparent, the hood still cold enough that the frost was just barely giving up its grip. Then I looked back at Cheryl. "You're kidding me," I said. She was not kidding. "My name is Steve Hoffman, and I've lived in the Pinecrest Hollow subdivision for 11 years. 11 years of paying my HOA dues on time. 11 years of keeping my lawn trimmed and my gutters clean. 11 years of painting my shutters the approved shade of colonial blue and not one shade darker or lighter. I had been a model resident. Not because I was afraid of the HOA, but because I genuinely cared about the neighborhood and it just wasn't worth the hassle. At least, that's what I told myself. But that morning, standing in my doorway in my thermal socks and my coffee-stained sweatshirt, watching Cheryl Ridgeway try to hand me a $150 fine for warming up my truck on the coldest morning of the year, something shifted in me. Something shifted in a big way. Let me back up and tell you how we got here, because this story didn't start with a fine notice. It started about 2 weeks before that morning, right after the first big snowfall of the season dropped 14 inches of snow on Pinecrest Hollow in about 18 hours. A proper winter storm, the kind that shuts down schools and makes the local news send a reporter to stand in a grocery store parking lot and talk about bread and milk shortages. The kind of storm where every sensible person in a northern climate does the exact same thing. They let their truck or car warm up for a good long stretch before they try to drive it anywhere. I should tell you a little about my truck, because it matters. It's a 2009 Ford F-250 diesel, and I use it for work. I run a small landscaping and snow removal business, so in the winter, that truck is my livelihood. It's got a plow blade on the front and a salt spreader in the bed, and it is not exactly a gentle machine. Diesel engines in extreme cold are notoriously finicky. They need warm-up time. Ask any diesel mechanic, any truck driver, any tradesman who works outdoors in January, and they will all tell you the same thing. You do not just hop in a cold diesel at 6 below and hammer it into drive. You warm it up properly or you pay for it in repairs. I wasn't running my truck in the driveway out of some kind of arrogance or laziness. I was protecting a $30,000 piece of equipment that I depended on to pay my mortgage, including, by the way, the HOA dues that funded Cheryl Ridgeway's little enforcement crusade. Now, Cheryl Ridgeway had been on the Pinecrest Hollow HOA board for about 4 years at this point. She had originally joined as the social committee chair, which you might think would be a harmless enough role. But somewhere along the way, she got herself appointed to the enforcement committee, and from there, she had apparently decided that her true calling in life was finding violations. She had fined the Pattersons for a basketball hoop that was 2 inches too high. She had issued a warning to old Harold Gibbons for parking his RV in the side yard, where nobody could even see it from the street. She had sent a certified letter to the Nguyen family about the color of their flower pots on their front porch. Not the flowers, the pots. The woman had a gift for this stuff and not in a good way. So when that first big snowstorm hit, I was out at 2 in the morning plowing driveways for clients. That's the job. When it snows hard, you work through the night. I got home around 5 in the morning, got a couple hours of sleep, and then got back up because I had more driveways to do and the snow was still coming down. I started the truck at around 6:30 in the morning, let it run while I ate a quick breakfast and drank some coffee, checked my route, and then headed back out. I didn't think anything of it. I had done the exact same thing every single winter morning for years, and nobody had ever said a word. 3 days after that first storm, I found a notice taped to my mailbox. Not in it, but taped to the outside of it, which I thought was kind of weird. It was printed on HOA letterhead, and it informed me that I had been observed idling my vehicle in my driveway for a period exceeding 5 minutes, in violation of Regulation 4.17, subsection B, and that I was being issued a formal warning. First offense. Further violations would result in a fine of $150 per occurrence. I honestly laughed when I read it. I thought it was a joke. I went inside and pulled out my HOA documents, which I actually keep in a file folder because I like to know what I've agreed to, and I flipped to Regulation 4.17, and sure enough, there it was. No resident shall idle any motorized vehicle in a private driveway, common area, or street within the community for a continuous period exceeding 5 minutes, with the intent to limit noise and exhaust pollution within the community. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I read it again. I had 2 thoughts. First thought, this rule in the abstract has a certain logic to it. In a normal neighborhood on a normal day, someone letting their car idle for 20 minutes in the driveway while they watch YouTube videos inside the house is kind of annoying. Fine, sure, I get it. Second thought, it was the middle of January in a state where the temperature routinely drops below zero, and applying this rule to someone warming up a work truck on a cold morning was the dumbest thing I had ever seen. I filed the warning in my folder and got back to work. The second storm hit about a week later. This one was even worse than the first. 8 inches of fresh snow on top of the ice layer that had formed after the first storm partially melted and then refroze. My driveway was basically a bobsled track. I had to throw down 3 buckets of ice melt just to be able to walk to my truck without falling. The temperature that morning was 6 degrees, and the wind chill brought it to about -8. I started my truck at 6:15, went inside to finish getting ready, packed my work bag, ate something, and came back out at about 6:40 or 6:45. So roughly 25 to 30 minutes of warm-up time. Totally reasonable for a diesel engine in those conditions. Any mechanic will tell you the same. I had just pulled out of the driveway and was heading down Pinecrest Drive when I noticed a car parked at the end of the street. Cheryl Ridgeway's silver Buick, sitting there with its parking lights on. She was in it and I could see she had her phone out. She was filming my driveway. I almost stopped to say something, but I had paying clients waiting for their driveways to be plowed, so I let it go and drove on. The next morning, right at 6:58, there she was at my door, the fine notice in her hand, $150. Violation of Regulation 4.17. Subsection B. She looked absolutely delighted, in that particular way that people who love rules look when they catch someone breaking one. There was a little flush in her cheeks that wasn't entirely from the cold. "Good morning, Steve," she said, smiling in a way that had no warmth in it whatsoever. "I have a notice for you." "I can see that," I said. She explained the violation as if I had never heard of Regulation 4.17, which of course I had because she had already sent me the warning. She told me she had observed and documented my vehicle idling for a period significantly in excess of 5 minutes. She told me that the HOA had been very patient with me after the first warning, and that now the board had no choice but to issue the formal fine. She told me I had 30 days to pay or the fine would double. "Cheryl," I said, "it was 6 degrees outside this morning." "The regulation doesn't have a temperature exception, Steve," she said. "It probably should," I said. She gave me a smile that was really just teeth and handed me the fine notice. "Have a good day," she said, and crunched back down my icy front walk toward her car, which she had left running in the street in front of my house for, by my estimation, at least 10 minutes. I looked at the fine notice. Then I looked at her car idling in the street. Then I looked back at the fine notice. I went inside, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table. I opened my laptop. I pulled out my phone. And I started doing research. Because here's the thing about me that Cheryl Ridgeway did not know. Before I started the landscaping business, I spent 6 years working for a property management company. I know how HOAs work. I know what they can and can't do. I know what language in governing documents is enforceable and what language is not. And I had a strong suspicion that Cheryl Ridgeway's enforcement of Regulation 4.17 had a few problems. The first thing I did was read the regulation again, very carefully. No resident shall idle any motorized vehicle in a private driveway, common area, or street within the community for a continuous period exceeding 5 minutes, with the intent to limit noise and exhaust pollution within the community. I put the phrase, "with the intent to limit noise and exhaust pollution," in my notes and drew a circle around it. In a lot of states, HOA rules that restrict certain behaviors have to be reasonable and consistently enforced. If you selectively enforce a rule, or if the rule is so broadly written that it catches completely ordinary and necessary behavior, you can have a problem with enforceability. More importantly, most states have what's called a reasonableness standard for HOA enforcement, meaning that even if a rule exists on paper, the HOA can't enforce it in a manner that's objectively unreasonable given the circumstances. Starting a diesel work truck on a 6-degree morning so it doesn't destroy itself. Pretty objectively reasonable. Would any judge in a northern state look at that situation and say the homeowner was wrong? I seriously doubted it. But I didn't just want legal theory. I wanted specifics. I pulled up my state's HOA statutes, which are publicly available online, and which I had actually read before I ever bought in Pinecrest Hollow. I found the relevant section and took notes. Our state requires that before an HOA can impose a fine, they must provide written notice and an opportunity to be heard at a hearing before the board. I had received a written warning, and now I had a fine, but I had not been offered or scheduled for any hearing. That was potentially a procedural defect right there. I also checked the specific language about what constitutes a violation under our HOA's governing documents. The CC and RS, which are the conditions, covenants, and restrictions that all homeowners agree to, actually contained a provision saying that enforcement of all regulations must be applied uniformly and without discrimination to all residents. I wrote that down too, and then I sat back and thought about Cheryl's car idling in the street in front of my house while she was delivering the fine notice. I picked up my phone and opened it to my camera roll. I had a security camera on my front porch that I had installed about 2 years earlier after someone had stolen a couple of Amazon packages. It wasn't anything fancy, just a Ring camera, but it covered the whole front of my property including the street. And since the camera had been recording all morning, I was fairly confident it had captured Cheryl's Buick sitting in the street with the engine running while she walked up to my door and handed me a fine notice. I pulled up the app, went back to that morning's footage, and found the timestamp. Cheryl had pulled up in front of my house at 6:53 in the morning. She walked to my door at 6:58, spent about 4 minutes talking to me, and walked back to her car and drove away at 7:05. Her car had been idling in the street in front of my house for 12 minutes. I set my coffee down and read the regulation one more time. No resident shall idle any motorized vehicle in a private driveway, common area, or street within the community. Street. It specifically said street. Cheryl Ridgeway, the chair of the enforcement committee, had idled her own car on a community street for 12 minutes while she was handing me a fine for idling my truck for about 25 minutes. And the street in front of my house was, without any question, a community street within Pinecrest Hollow. I saved the clip and emailed it to myself. Then I printed it as a screenshot with a timestamp visible, Then I thought about something else. I had already had one warning taped to my mailbox. I pulled up the HOA rules on mailbox tampering and found that technically, placing anything on or in a resident's mailbox without going through the Postal Service can be a federal issue. But more relevantly for my purposes, our own HOA governing documents required all formal correspondence to be sent via first-class mail or hand-delivered directly to the resident. Taping something to the outside of a mailbox wasn't either of those things. So the first warning may not have been properly delivered, which meant there was an argument that I had never received proper first notice, which meant the fine based on the second offense framework might not be valid. I was now taking notes on a legal pad and feeling quite a bit better about my morning. Now, I want to be clear. I wasn't trying to dodge legitimate accountability. If I had genuinely been doing something unreasonable, I would have owned it. But the situation here was absurd. It was dangerously cold. I had a diesel engine that legitimately needed warm-up time, and the woman who was fining me had done the exact same thing I did on the same morning, during the very act of issuing the fine. That's not enforcement. That's harassment with a legal costume on. I called my neighbor, Dave Kowalski, because Dave is a retired electrician who has lived in Pinecrest Hollow for 20 years and knows everything about everyone in this neighborhood. Dave answered on the second ring because Dave is always up early. "Hey Dave," I said, "you got a minute? I want to tell you about what just happened to me." Dave was quiet for a second after I explained it all, and then he said, "Steve, she did the same thing to the Hendersons last week." "What?" "Yeah. Brian Henderson let his minivan warm up before taking the kids to school, and she left him a fine notice on his door. Same violation, $150. I asked Dave if he knew if anyone else had gotten fined for the same thing this winter, and Dave said he'd ask around. He called me back 40 minutes later with 3 more names. The Garcias on Maple Court, Tom Willard on Birchwood Lane, and Donna Pelletier, who was a single mom with 2 kids and a 15-year-old Honda Civic that she basically needed to run for 10 minutes on cold mornings, or it would stall at the first intersection. 5 residents fined for warming up their vehicles during the coldest winter stretch in recent memory. $150 each. And from what Dave was telling me, at least 2 of them had already paid their fines without questioning them, because they didn't know they could question them. $750 collected from residents for essentially surviving winter. And here was something else Dave mentioned almost as a throwaway comment. He'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Cheryl had been pushing the board to reallocate some of the HOA's general fine revenue to cover certain administrative expenses, which apparently now included purchasing new office supplies, updating the HOA's website, and paying for Cheryl's travel to a property management conference in Phoenix, Arizona in February. Dave wasn't sure if the budget reallocation had been voted on properly or not. That last detail stopped me cold, pun intended. I told Dave I'd be in touch and started making calls. The first call was to Brian Henderson. Brian was furious, which I expected, because Brian is generally pretty even-tempered, which meant when he was furious it was because something was genuinely outrageous. He'd paid his fine already, but he still had the notice and he photographed it and texted it to me. I told him what I was thinking and he said, without hesitation, "I'm in. What do you need?" The second call was to Donna Pelletier. Donna had not paid her fine yet, and she was stressed about it, because $150 was a significant amount of money for her right now, especially in winter when heating bills were brutal. I told her not to pay it yet, not to ignore it, but to hold off while I dug into a few things. She was grateful and a little emotional, which made me even more motivated. The third call was to a guy named Marcus Webb, who was a lawyer who lived 2 streets over in Pinecrest Hollow. I had met Marcus at the neighborhood block party 3 summers ago. He was a civil attorney who did a lot of contract and real estate work, and I knew he had been on the wrong end of a zoning dispute with the HOA about his fence 2 years back that had been quietly settled. When I called Marcus and gave him the broad strokes of the situation, He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Steve, forward me everything you have and let me look at it tonight." I spent the rest of the afternoon putting together a document package. I had the fine notice with its timestamp. I had the security camera footage from my Ring camera showing Cheryl's car idling in the street. I had the original warning notice with its photo showing it taped to my mailbox rather than properly delivered. I had notes from my reading of the CC and RS and the state HOA statutes. I had the 5 names of residents who had received the same fine this winter. And I had Dave's account of the potential budget reallocation issue, which I noted was unverified but worth looking into. I also did one more thing that afternoon. I dug out my truck's maintenance manual and the official Ford warranty documentation for the 2009 F-250 diesel, which included a section on cold weather operation. It specifically stated that for temperatures below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, extended warm-up periods were recommended to avoid damage to the engine and fuel system. I photographed the relevant pages and added them to my file. I sent everything to Marcus. Marcus called me back that evening around 9, while I was sitting by the fireplace with the news on in the background showing weather forecasts for another incoming system. More snow. Another foot expected by the weekend. Of course. "Steve," Marcus said, "I've gone through all of this. You've got at least 2 solid procedural defects on the fine itself. The first notice wasn't properly delivered per the HOA's own bylaws, which means the second offense designation may not hold. And more importantly, our state statute is pretty clear that residents are entitled to a hearing before a fine is imposed, not after, unless they waive that right. You never waived anything. That fine may be entirely unenforceable as issued." "That's what I thought," I said. "There's more," Marcus said. "The security footage of Cheryl idling in the street for 12 minutes on the same morning she issued you the fine. That's a direct violation of the same regulation. If they're going to enforce this rule, they have to enforce it consistently. Selective enforcement is a classic CC and R defense." "And what about the budget thing Dave mentioned? The conference in Phoenix?" Marcus paused. "That one I can't confirm yet without seeing the actual board minutes and financial records. But here's the thing, Steve. HOA members have the right to request those documents. Under our state's HOA transparency laws, the board is required to provide access to financial records, meeting minutes, and budget documents to any member who requests them in writing. I'd send that request tomorrow." I asked Marcus what he thought I should do about the hearing. "Request it," he said immediately. "You're entitled to it. Put it in writing, send it certified mail to the HOA's registered address, and request a hearing before the full board within the timeframe specified in your CC and RS. Then gather everyone else who's been fined and see if they want to come together. Can we bring all 5 cases to one hearing? You can certainly request it. The board doesn't have to agree, but you can make the case that these are all the same regulation applied under the same circumstances. A unified presentation would be stronger. And the documentation request, financial records. Send a formal written request for all meeting minutes from the last 12 months, the current budget, all fine revenue documentation, and specifically any records related to reallocation of fine revenue to administrative expenses. Do it tomorrow first thing." We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the time I hung up I felt good. Not smug, because I hadn't won anything yet, but clear. I had a plan, I had documentation, I had a lawyer in my corner, and I had 4 neighbors who were as fed up as I was. The HOA had picked the wrong morning to come knocking on my door. The next morning I sent 3 certified letters. The first was to the HOA board requesting a formal hearing on the fine assessed to me, citing my state statutory right to a pre-hearing notice and the procedural defects in the fine issuance. The second was a formal written request for all financial records, meeting minutes, budget documents, and fine revenue records from the past 12 months, citing our state's HOA records access statute by section number. The third was a letter to Cheryl Ridgeway personally, notifying her that I had reviewed security camera footage from the morning in question, and that her personal vehicle had been documented idling on a community street for approximately 12 minutes in potential violation of the same regulation 4.17 subsection B, for which she had issued my fine, and that I was requesting clarification on whether the board intended to apply this regulation to all residents equally. That third letter was Marcus's idea, and I'll admit I enjoyed writing it. Meanwhile, Dave Kowalski had done what Dave Kowalski does, which is talk to absolutely everyone in the neighborhood, and by the end of the day I had heard from Tom Willard, the Garcias, Brian Henderson, and Donna Pelletier, all of whom wanted to come to whatever hearing was scheduled. I also heard from about a dozen other residents who hadn't been fined for this particular violation, but who had their own issues with Cheryl and the enforcement committee, and wanted to know what was happening. The winter just kept delivering. Another storm hit midweek, a fast-moving system that dropped 6 fresh inches in about 4 hours. The roads were a mess. There were 3 fender benders on the main road into the subdivision before noon, and the HOA's snow removal contractor, who the HOA hired to plow the community roads, showed up 3 hours late. One of the residents on Birchwood Lane actually got their car stuck trying to get out to go to work because the road hadn't been plowed, and they missed a shift. People were not happy, and a lot of that unhappiness was being directed at the HOA board, which many residents felt had been spending too much time on trivial enforcement and not enough time on actual community management. Cheryl, to her credit or possibly just to her general disposition, seemed oblivious to the gathering storm of community frustration. She sent a response to my hearing request that was about as warm as the weather, a single paragraph stating that the board would schedule a hearing at their convenience within the 30-day period allowed under the CC and RS, and that in the meantime my fine remained outstanding and accruing interest. Interest. She added interest language. My fine was accruing interest at a rate of 1.5% per month, which was specified somewhere in the fine print of the CC and RS. I forwarded her response to Marcus, who sent back a one-word email. Good. I called him to find out what that meant. It means she's not backing down, which means this goes to a hearing, which means you get to present everything you've compiled in front of the full board, which means the board members who aren't Cheryl will have to sit there and watch you lay out the procedural defects, the video of Cheryl's own violation, the fact that 5 residents were fined under the same rule during extreme cold weather, and whatever we find in the financial documents. Have you looked at the financials yet? I asked. Still waiting for the response to your records request. They have 10 days under the statute, but I've been doing some digging on my own. Steve, the HOA's last publicly filed tax return shows that fine revenue has increased by about 300% in the last 2 years. That's a significant jump. It could be a coincidence, but it lines up with when Cheryl joined the enforcement committee. 300%. Also, Marcus said, I found out that the property management conference in Phoenix that Dave mentioned, the HOA did pay for Cheryl to attend, and also paid for her hotel, which was apparently a resort property. Total cost to the HOA was around $2,200. The board voted on it barely, 4-3, and the meeting minutes show that the vote took place at a meeting where only 5 of the 8 board members were present, and proper advance notice of the agenda item may not have been given to all members. Is that a problem? It's potentially a procedural problem with the vote itself. If the vote to approve those expenditures wasn't properly conducted under the HOA's own bylaws, the expenditure might not have been validly authorized. And if the funds came from fine revenue that was collected in a procedurally defective manner. He let that trail off, but I understood what he was saying. I asked him how we should handle it at the hearing, and he laid out a strategy that I thought was clean and methodical. We wouldn't go in hot. We wouldn't yell or accuse. We would present the factual record, piece by piece, calmly and professionally, and let the board members process what they were seeing. The goal wasn't just to get my fine dismissed. The goal was to demonstrate a pattern. The hearing was scheduled for the second Thursday in February. That gave me about 2 weeks to prepare, which was 2 weeks of cold weather, 2 more snow events, 2 more mornings of warming up my diesel truck, and I noticed, 2 more mornings where Cheryl's car idled in the street or in the HOA community parking lot adjacent to the clubhouse for extended periods. I captured all of it on video from various angles, because it turns out when you start paying attention, you see a lot. I also had a conversation with Harold Gibbons, the retired gentleman who had gotten a warning about his RV, and he told me something interesting. He had been doing some digging through old HOA board meeting minutes, which were technically public record for residents, and he had found that Regulation 4.17, the idling rule, had been added to the CC and RS about 3 years ago at a board meeting where only 4 of the 8 board members were present, and only 2 members of the community attended the public comment period. Harold, who was 82 years old and had more energy than I did, had gone through the state statutes on HOA rule amendments and found that amendments to CC and RS in our state required approval by a majority of the full board, not just those present at a given meeting. A quorum meeting with a 4-0 vote might not constitute a proper majority of the full 8-person board. I passed that to Marcus immediately. Marcus spent a day with it and came back to me with a careful assessment. There was a reasonable argument that if the rule amendment wasn't properly adopted, the rule might not be validly part of the CC and RS, which would mean the fines based on that rule might have no legal foundation at all. He cautioned me that this was a more complex legal argument and that reasonable people could disagree, but he thought it was worth raising at the hearing. 2 days before the hearing, I got the response to my financial records request. It was a thick envelope, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a fresh legal pad and went through it page by page. The documents confirmed what Marcus had found in the public filings. Fine revenue had spiked dramatically. In the year before Cheryl joined the enforcement committee, total fine revenue was about $4,000 for the whole year. In the most recent fiscal year, it was over $14,000. And the line item for administrative expenses had more than doubled, with the largest single expenditures being the Phoenix conference trip, a board training and development expense that appeared to cover materials sent to Cheryl's home address, and several charges at what appeared to be a restaurant that I personally knew Cheryl frequented because she had mentioned it more than once at community events. I photographed every page and sent the whole package to Marcus. Marcus was quiet on the phone after he'd reviewed it for a couple of hours. Then he said, "Steve, I think we need to bring in one more person." "Who?" "There's a state agency that handles complaints about HOA financial misconduct. It's not exactly a law enforcement body, but they have investigative authority and they can refer matters to the Attorney General's office if they find evidence of misappropriation of community funds. I think what you have here is worth a referral. Before the hearing or after. Let's see what happens at the hearing. If the board acts reasonably, acknowledges the problems and commits to correcting them, that's one outcome. If they stonewall or try to retaliate, then we go to the agency." I agreed with that approach. The night before the hearing, I got a call from Donna Pelletier. She had heard from another neighbor, a woman named Karen Ochoa who lived across from Cheryl, that Cheryl had been going around the neighborhood in the days leading up to the hearing trying to convince people not to attend, telling them it was going to be a circus, that I was a troublemaker, that the hearing was just going to be one angry guy yelling about a fine, and that good neighbors should trust the board to handle things professionally. I thanked Donna for the heads up, and then I called Dave Kowalski, who I knew had a network of relationships in the neighborhood that made him the closest thing Pinecrest Hollow had to a news wire service. "Dave," I said, "how many people do you think will show up to the hearing tomorrow night?" Dave paused. "Steve," he said, "I've been talking to people for 2 weeks. The road plowing debacle, the fines, the conference trip. People are done. I'd expect at least 30 or 40 residents. The hearing was held at the community clubhouse at 7 in the evening. By 6:50, I counted 46 people in the parking lot and more arriving. The clubhouse's main meeting room held about 60, and it filled up. People were standing in the back. There were residents I recognized and some I barely knew. Donna Pelletier was there with Brian Henderson and his wife. Tom Willard was there. The Garcias were there. Marcus Webb was there in his good coat with his briefcase, looking entirely calm, which was somehow both reassuring and a little intimidating. The board filed in at 7 on the dot. There were 7 board members present, and the moment they saw the room, I watched all of them do a small double take except for Cheryl, who looked briefly surprised before arranging her face into an expression of controlled authority. She was wearing a blazer and had her HOA folder open on the table in front of her. The board president, a quiet man named Dale Forsyth, who I actually liked and who I suspected had some mixed feelings about the direction the enforcement committee had been heading, called the meeting to order. He noted that the hearing was a formal proceeding and that decorum would be maintained. Marcus had advised me to let the board lead first. Let them present their case and then present mine. Don't interrupt, don't react, take notes. Cheryl presented the violation. She was thorough and articulate, I'll give her that. She had her own documentation, including a log she had apparently been keeping on my driveway activity over several mornings, with timestamps and notations. She explained the regulation, she explained the fine structure, she explained the warning that had been issued. She seemed confident. When she finished, Dale looked at me and asked if I wanted to present my response. I stood up and took my time. Marcus had helped me organize the presentation into a clear logical sequence, and I had practiced it twice the evening before. I started with the procedural defects. I showed the board the original warning notice with photographs demonstrating it had been taped to the outside of my mailbox rather than properly delivered. I cited the CC and R language requiring proper delivery methods. I noted that if the first warning hadn't been properly delivered, the second offense designation was invalid. 2 of the board members looked at each other. Then I addressed the hearing right. I cited the specific state statute requiring an opportunity for a hearing prior to the imposition of a fine, unless waived. I noted I had not waived anything. Cheryl started to say something, but Dale held up a hand and she stopped. Then I pulled out the laptop I'd brought and played the security camera footage. The room was very quiet as the video showed Cheryl's Buick pulling up in front of my house, parking, and idling for 12 full minutes. I had the timestamp displayed clearly at the bottom of the screen. I let it play in real time for about 30 seconds and then said, "This is from the same morning the fine was issued. Cheryl's vehicle was idling on Pinecrest Drive, a community street, for approximately 12 minutes. Regulation 4.17 explicitly includes community streets." I heard murmuring behind me. Cheryl said, "That's not comparable. I was there on HOA business." "The regulation doesn't have an HOA business exception," I said, and I let that sit. Then I went through the 5 other residents who had received fines under the same regulation during the same winter cold snap. I let each of them briefly describe their situation. Donna Pelletier stood up and talked about her 15-year-old car and how she needed to let it warm up so she could safely take her kids to school in the dark on icy roads. And the room behind me got very quiet in a way that suggested a lot of people were paying close attention to her. Then I introduced the truck manufacturer's documentation recommending extended warm-up times for diesel engines at temperatures below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. I wasn't doing anything unsafe or unusual. I was following the manufacturer's own guidance for operating the vehicle I depended on for my livelihood. And then Marcus stood up. Marcus was calm and professional and precise, and he laid out the potential argument that Regulation 4.17 may not have been properly adopted in the first place, citing the meeting attendance records and the state statute's requirements for amendment approval. He said he was not making a definitive legal ruling. That wasn't his role here, but that there was a substantial question about the rule's validity that the board should consider carefully before pursuing any of these fines further. He then addressed the financial records. He didn't accuse anyone of anything directly. He simply presented the numbers. Fine revenue up 300% over 2 years. Administrative expenses more than doubled, specific line items that appeared to benefit individual board members. A conference expenditure that may not have been properly authorized. He said that he had already prepared a formal inquiry to submit to the state HOA oversight agency unless the board chose to address these matters themselves, and he slid copies of his prepared inquiry to each of the 7 board members. The room behind us was dead silent. Cheryl had gone from controlled authority to something that looked a lot more like alarm. Her cheeks were flushed, and she was flipping through her folder in a way that suggested she was looking for something that wasn't going to save her. Dale Forsythe asked the board members if they had questions. One of them, a guy named Phil Reus, who I'd always thought seemed like a reasonable person, cleared his throat and asked Cheryl directly about the Phoenix conference expense. Cheryl said it had been authorized by the board. Phil said the minutes showed only 4 board members had been present at that vote. Cheryl said a quorum was present. Phil said the CC and RS required a majority of the full board for expenditure approvals above a certain threshold. He had apparently also done his homework. Another board member, a woman named Sandra Torres, said she had been one of the 3 dissenting votes on that expenditure and that she hadn't been given proper advance notice of the agenda item. I had not scripted this part. This was the board eating its own tail, and I was just watching it happen. Dale called a 5-minute recess. During the recess, the community room buzzed with conversation. People were comparing notes, pulling out their own fine notices, talking to each other about things that had been bothering them for months. I stood near the back with Marcus, who was very composed and said nothing, just watched. When the board reconvened, Dale Forsythe looked like a man who had made a decision. He announced that the board was dismissing all fines issued under Regulation 4.17 during the months of December through February, pending a review of the regulation's applicability during extreme cold weather conditions and a review of its original adoption process. He said the board would commission an independent review of HOA financial expenditures from the past 2 years, to be conducted by an outside accountant and presented to the full membership. He said that effective immediately, the Enforcement Committee's authority to issue fines was suspended pending a restructuring of enforcement procedures to ensure compliance with state statutes. And then he looked at Cheryl and said that the board would be scheduling a separate meeting to discuss her role on the Enforcement Committee. Cheryl started to speak, and Dale said, firmly, that the hearing had concluded. The room behind me did not exactly erupt in applause because this wasn't a movie and we were all adults, but there was a sustained and unmistakable sound of about 46 people exhaling with relief and then breaking into conversation, and several of them shook my hand and Marcus's hand on the way out. Donna Pelletier hugged me, which I was not expecting but which seemed entirely appropriate. Outside in the parking lot in the cold, dark air, the snow that had been forecast was just starting to fall. Light flakes, lazy and slow, drifting down through the orange glow of the parking lot lights. People stood in small groups talking. Brian Henderson clapped me on the shoulder and told me he was going to request a refund on the fine he'd already paid, and Marcus confirmed he had every right to do so under the circumstances. Dave Kowalski appeared at my elbow wearing an enormous parka that made him look like he was dressed for an Arctic expedition. That, he said, was the best HOA meeting this neighborhood has ever had. I laughed, and it felt good to laugh. The independent financial review happened over the next 3 weeks. The outside accountant found several additional irregular expenditures that had not been on my original list, including a charge for what appeared to be holiday gifts purchased at a high-end home goods store that had never been presented to or approved by the membership. And 2. Consulting fees that were paid to an entity that, when researched, appeared to have no business registration and shared a mailing address with a member of Cheryl's immediate family. That last part crossed from administrative irregularity into something considerably more serious. Marcus submitted the documentation to the state HOA oversight agency, as he had indicated he would. He also sent a summary to the county district attorney's office with a cover letter noting the potential financial crimes involved. I didn't take any pleasure in that escalation. I genuinely didn't. But the numbers were the numbers, and the addresses were the addresses, and the law doesn't make exceptions for people who happen to run neighborhood associations. The HOA Oversight Agency opened a formal inquiry within 2 weeks. The county district attorney's office contacted Marcus to say they were reviewing the material. Cheryl Ridgeway resigned from the HOA board before the oversight agency completed its initial review. Her letter of resignation was brief and contained no acknowledgement of any wrongdoing, which I expected. What I did not expect was that she put her house in Pinecrest Hollow up for sale about a month later, and she was gone from the neighborhood before the snow had fully melted in the spring. The district attorney's office ultimately charged Cheryl with 1 count of misappropriation of fiduciary funds, which is a felony in our state when the amount exceeds a certain threshold, and 1 count of fraudulent misrepresentation related to the consulting fee payments. She reached a plea agreement that involved repaying all misappropriated funds, a substantial fine from the court, 2 years of probation, and community service. She did not go to prison, but she had a felony conviction on her record and a repayment obligation that I suspected was going to follow her for a while. The reorganized HOA board, which now included Phil Reis as president and Sandra Torres as enforcement committee chair, revised Regulation 4.17 to include a winter weather exception, allowing extended warm-up periods during days when the temperature or wind chill was below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. They also rewrote the enforcement procedures from scratch to ensure compliance with state statute, including mandatory hearings before any fine was imposed, and proper written notice via certified mail for all formal correspondence. They hired a better snow removal contractor too, one who actually showed up when it was snowing. Donna Pelletier sent me a card in the mail, an actual physical card with a stamp on it, thanking me for not just paying the fine and moving on. She wrote in her neat handwriting, "I didn't think we could push back on them. I'm glad you showed me we could. I kept that card." In late March, just as the last of the winter snow was finally releasing its grip on the neighborhood, and the first thin suggestions of mud season were appearing at the edges of the yards, I was out in my driveway on a cold but not brutal morning, maybe 32 degrees, still cold enough that my breath made clouds, and I started my truck. I let it run for a full 10 minutes while I loaded my work gear into the cab, and then I drove out of the subdivision through the community streets with the window down and my elbow on the door. A neighbor I didn't know well, a young woman who was walking her dog, waved at me from the sidewalk. I waved back. It's a small thing, waving at a neighbor, but it felt good. It felt like things were more or less okay. The engine ran smooth and warm and clean, and there wasn't a yellow fine notice anywhere in sight. I'll be honest with you, I didn't start that whole fight because I wanted to be some kind of hero. I started it because I was cold and tired and being nickel-and-dimed by someone who thought having a title on a lanyard meant she could treat regular people like problems to be managed rather than neighbors to be respected. I started it because Donna Pelletier shouldn't have had to stress about a $150 fine for warming up her car so she could safely take her kids to school. I started it because the people who run these organizations, the HOAs, the associations, the boards, They have real authority over your property and your money. And with that authority comes real responsibility. And if you abuse it, someone eventually has to say something. Might as well be me. My truck still makes that gravel mixer sound on the first cold morning of every winter, when the temperature drops and the frost comes back and the whole season resets itself. And every morning when I hear it, I think about how much I enjoy watching it warm up properly, the exhaust curling up into the cold air, the engine settling into a smooth idle, every component doing exactly what it was designed to do. There's no timer on it. There's no fine notice coming. And if one ever did come, I know exactly what to do. The winter eventually ended, as winters do. The neighborhood pulled together in a way that I hadn't seen in years. People actually talking to each other at the mailboxes and the community mailbox kiosk, checking on the older residents when the ice was bad, sharing their snow blowers and their extra bags of ice melt. The HOA board met monthly, and the meetings were posted on the new neighborhood website and minutes were distributed promptly, and the budget was transparent, and the community funds went toward things the community actually needed. It's funny how much better things work when the person in charge of enforcement is actually trying to serve the community instead of squeeze it. I still run my landscaping and snow removal business. That truck is still in my driveway every morning. This past winter was actually one of the colder ones in recent memory, with a stretch of about 2 weeks in January where the temperature didn't get above 15 degrees during the day. And I started that diesel every morning and let it run until it was good and warm. Nobody said a word. More than that, one morning Phil Reis, who lives 3 houses down and who drives an older pickup of his own, rolled his window down when he drove past and called out, "Smart thinking on the warm-up, Steve. My mechanic told me the same thing." I gave him a thumbs up. Life in Pinecrest Hollow was quiet and civilized and appropriately managed by people who had actually read the statutes they were supposed to be following, and that was more or less all anyone had ever wanted. Sometimes all it takes is one cold morning, one ridiculous fine notice, and one person who decides to look up the rules instead of just paying the bill. Turns out the rules were on my side the whole time. They usually are, when someone's actually following them correctly. And as for Regulation 4.17, subsection B, the revised version now reads in part, during periods of extreme cold weather, defined as ambient temperatures or wind chill values below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, residents are permitted to idle vehicles in private driveways for a reasonable period necessary to safely operate the vehicle, not to exceed 30 minutes. 30 minutes. Reasonable, specific, practical, and enforceable. The kind of rule that treats people like adults, which is really all any of us were asking for from the beginning.